Hi, everyone. It's Alexander Fernandez with Video Games Real Talk. It is season 4, and we got a great guest for us today. A good friend of mine, Sam Glassenberg. Sam, how you doing?
Awesome. Great to be here, Alexander.
I know, right? You have to keep a straight face as we go through this conversation. It's going to be a lot of fun. Don't worry. So,
We're gonna
Sam,
have a good time.
yeah,
I'm looking forward to this.
yeah, me too, man. It's been a while. It's been a minute, but for all my for all the viewers out there and listeners out there that don't know Sam and what Sam Glassenberg has been up to, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and basically what you do?
Sure. Want me to sort of like start at the beginning
No, just tell me what you do. Like, what are you doing right now? What's your thing?
so right now I run a company called Level X, medical video game studio. We make video games for doctors.
So, okay, this is pretty cool. This is the first time that we've ever actually covered video games for health, video games for doctors. This is a brand new field, and I know it's definitely something that is going to be fascinating for everyone. But before we get into that, I want to just cover a couple things of your background so people know
Sure.
where you came from. So when you and I first met back in the double O's, the beginning of the double O's, you were running a video games company dedicated to making games for Hollywood. It was
Right.
a company called
With FTX Games, yeah. Contact.
FTX Games, right. And before that, you ran basically DirectX for Microsoft, right?
I led the DirectX graphics team.
Yeah, okay, so this is hot. So for all the kids out there that don't know what DirectX is, this is the reason why you have cutting-edge graphics on your computer.
Yeah.
It's Sam and his crew right there. And before that, you got your start at LucasArts, right?
At LucasArts, right? So Microsoft, my team's job was basically to build the Matrix. How do we figure out how to make video games look real? And then before that, I was at LucasArts working on Star Wars games, Episode 2 games. I was hired as an animator. So I started my career as an artist and then moved into technical art and, engineering. And I've held a whole bunch of different roles in the games industry, and now I'm a suit.
So let me ask you something, because when you were building the Matrix at Microsoft, did you guys see the metaverse coming? Did you guys see that GPUs were going to be all connected the way they were, like network processing and all that? Was that something you guys were talking about, or was that
Yes. Yes.
Really?
So, well, look, I mean,
Yeah.
the metaverse stuff, we got to be very specific. I like to be specific when we talk about it.
Okay, we'll get
That's kind of like
okay.
everyone has their own definition of metaverse. But in terms of like a lot of what we see today, in terms of like network GPUs and cloud compute and all of this all this kind of stuff, cloud gaming, we did. Remember, so when you're making graphics hardware, it's a 5 to 10 year. It's a 5-year development cycle for the hardware. Like,
Really?
if you come up with something you want to create, it's 5 years until that hardware potentially hits the market. So what we were trying to do is basically predict 5 to 10 years out, what are video game developers going to want to be able to achieve visually in their games?
Mm-hmm.
Because it would take, you have to like move the entire ecosystem. And, if you come up with something you think is a great idea, but then in 10 years or 5 years, video game developers don't actually want to use that feature, you're actually dedicating a whole bunch of silicon in, graphics and GPUs you're not going to use. So what we would do, my team's job was to figure out, all right, what do these games want to be able to achieve visually? What are we going to have in terms of compute power, just looking at Moore's law? And then, all right, what do we need from an ecosystem perspective? What does the hardware need to be able to do? What does the software need to be able to do? What do the tools like Maya and Max and ZBrush need to be able to do in order to allow us to create content that can run efficiently on that hardware?
So let me ask you, because I'm going to go on a tangent here, but I'm fascinated by this. So you guys are living 5 years in the future, and then would you guys evangelize what that future looks like then to everyone else, saying, hey, this is where it's going, everyone follow us, and people would just follow you? Or was it like, how do you get an entire industry to follow you, especially in games?
Yeah, so we were Microsoft, right? So we were basically DirectX is the layer that allows games to interact with graphics hardware. Mm-hmm. And same with Xbox, right? It's the same platform on Xbox. And so you want to have a rich ecosystem of graphics hardware where you have Intel and NVIDIA and AMD and everyone making graphics chips. Yeah. But you want to make sure that when game developers are doing that, you don't want each chip to look like its own game console. Right? You want a game developer to be able to make an awesome game that's going to play well on the breadth of hardware. So what we have to do is you have to basically we have to move the ecosystem forward as a group. So we would literally, I would bring some of the top game developers, the graphics devs from, Epic and Unity and Valve and we'd get, 50 of them together in a, we rent out a hotel in Western Washington once a year for 3 days. And we would bring everybody together to basically talk about, all right, what do we want to be able to achieve visually in games, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And then what are we going to need in order to be able to do that? So I remember one example, we brought Bay Rate, who was the creator of, he was the technical director on Golem for Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
Because one of the things that years, this is probably 2004-ish, 2005, everyone's like, look, we want to be able to have realistic characters that come to life in these games. What was the best, most realistic character we had at the time that was computer generated? It was Golem in Lord of the Rings. So we brought Bay in to talk about how he did it. Now, when you're doing it for Golem, you've got, 3 hours to generate each frame. In a video game, we got to do 30 to 60 frames a second. Right. So you would say, all right, how did he create it? Display subdivision surfaces. What were the tools they used? Morph target. How did they create it? And then, all right, when are we going to have enough compute power, if you follow Moore's law, to be able to do that in real time? And then what are the tools that we're going to need to make that happen? What does the hardware need to be able to do? What do software packages like Maya and ZBrush need to be able to do? What does the software need to be able to do so that we can have Golem, in real time in a video game? And now when you play, high-end games on your, Xbox One or PC, those characters are indistinguishable from reality. They look like the best CG characters you had in movies, a dozen years prior.
No, absolutely. So actually, this is a great segue because you've seen the evolution of video game graphics, video game hardware, real-time rendering, and that was for entertainment. But what you're doing right now is, this is real work. This is science. This is healthcare. So when you're talking about making games for doctors, first, how the hell did you get into that? And is it as cutting edge as I'm probably imagining? Or, thread it together. Tell us, what is it?
Sure.
What are you doing in there?
Yeah, so first off, it's still entertainment. That's the important thing.
Okay,
The best way to learn is through play.
That's true. Very true.
Where human beings have evolved millions of years. We learn through play. All of the history that I remember is from Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, right? Or geography. Right. It's not from what you learned in geography class.
Exactly right.
Right. That's because games are incredibly effective at education, usually as an indirect or unintended consequence of play.
Yeah.
And so they're very good at helping us understand systems. SimCity teaches you, I learned how cities work from SimCity.
That's very true.
Right?
Yeah.
We learn, you learn about fluid dynamics from playing, Where's My Water? You learn about parabolic flight from playing Angry Birds.
That's very true.
Games are very good at helping our brains develop a mental model for complex systems.
Right.
And so what we're doing at Level X is we're just unleashing, those same game mechanics and, we build on top of game technology to help doctors develop mental models for the complex systems they need to understand.
How'd you come up with this, man? Seriously.
By accident. I would love to say that I had some grand idea to do this, but it was all by accident.
Really? Okay, take us there, man.
I've had we've had moderately successful careers in the games industry, but basically all of this had made me the disgrace of my family because I come from a long line of doctors. My grandfather was a famous doctor. Both my parents, my wife. I'm the idiot that never went to med school. So I have terrible stories we can share later, maybe. So in 2012, my dad, he was an anesthesiologist here at Northwestern in Chicago, and he said, "All right, Sam, you're too old to go to med school. So put all the gaming nonsense to good use. Make me a game to train my colleagues to do a fiber optic intubation. It's a tricky procedure. We only do it on difficult patients. So even experienced anesthesiologists will struggle to do this if they haven't done enough cases." But he goes, "I don't want to have to drag anyone to the simulation center. Just make me a game they can play on their phones." So I'm busy running FTX. I'm running a Hollywood game company. Yeah. I have a lot of free time. So I go, out of guilt, I basically say, "All right, Dad, I sit down for 3 weekends. I throw together this terrible little game and I upload it to the App Store." Because this is before test flight. So Dad, I don't have time to install it on your friends' iPhones one by one. Here's the link. They can download it. Leave me alone. I don't think about it again. 2 years later, he called me to say, "All right, Sam, hey, how many people downloaded the app?" I go, "Dad, I don't know how many of your friends downloaded your game. I'll check for you." I went and I looked. we had 100,000 doctors, nurses, and airway specialists who've been playing this thing. Now, 100,000, like in games, where we make games for, played by 30 million people, but there's only 1 million doctors in the country.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe a few million more medical professionals. Like, it's a niche audience. It's a fiber optic laryngoscopy.
A very good niche audience too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm like, why is this happening? So I Google it and I discover, unbeknownst to me, they've been doing efficacy studies at medical schools all over the world that shows this crappy game I made for my dad is drastically improving physician performance. Wow. So that was a moment where I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Clearly there's demand for this sort of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So what if it wasn't just Sam, but it was, take the top developers, designers, artists from Activision and Ubisoft and Midway and, Disney, and you put them together with hundreds of top doctors, and other medical professionals across a wide range of specialties to advance the practice of medicine through play. So we're like 130 people now. This is what we do.
I mean, let me ask you something. So when your dad got the numbers, is this where it was like, I'm proud of you? Was there you finally did something with real consequence and meaning, or is it like still not good? It needs to be 1 million doctors. Or where are you?
No, I mean, yeah. So I mean, now he's happy.
Okay.
He's retired.
Okay, good.
He's still advising Level X. He still gets to come to the office and drive everybody crazy once in a while. They just did actually. Google Play just did a feature on interesting Google Play developers. They did a quick video. They interviewed him. He's sitting there in a fishing vest and a pith helmet. Talking about anesthesia techniques. It's hilarious.
That's amazing. So okay, so that you stumbled into this opportunity, but I mean, you had a storied career in games. It's not like you were in the gulag. I mean, you did great stuff, but take us to the beginning. How'd you get here?
Into games in general?
Yeah. How did you become the CEO from an animator? Let's be clear. You were, like you said, you come from a doctor's family, black sheep, decides to be an animator of all. You want to make cartoons. That's basically what they must have been thinking. You're making cartoons. What are you doing? It's like, take us through that. How did this?
Yeah, I guess it's a lot of accidents.
The making of
so, but I think a little bit of sort of setting yourself up correctly to be able to have
of course. I mean,
accidental opportunities. So I always did animation as a hobby. My undergraduate degree was in computer science, or computer engineering, but my hobby was animation. And so I applied to Lucasfilm as an animator. I wanted to do feature film. I applied at ILM. I also applied at Pixar and other places. And I got a job at Lucasfilm, they offered me not in the film division, but in the games division. I was like, LucasArts. I was like, all right, I'll try this out. And when I got there, I discovered, oh, wow, this is way more interesting. The games industry is evolving much faster than the film industry.
Yeah.
So my job, I was an animator. I was literally flying spaceships. I was animating cutscenes for Star Wars games.
Which one do you remember the most? What's out of all the ones you got?
Jedi Starfighter.
Yeah, well, there you go.
That was really cool. But it was just so much. It was between episode 1 and episode 2. These were the first games. We were making PlayStation 2 games, but these were the first games we were taking assets from production at ILM and actually incorporating them into the game. I mean, we had to down-res everything quite a bit because it was running on PS2. But we would get these crazy scans of Samuel L. Jackson's head and all the spaceships and everything. So it was a lot of fun. I got in because basically I submitted my reel. And managed to beat out, I don't know, apparently thousands of art students, just random animations I'd done as a hobby.
Pretty good then. You're apparently pretty good. You got into. Let's be clear. You got into ILM, into Lucas.
No, not ILM. I did not get a job at ILM. I got LucasArts.
LucasArts.
I think they saw it and they were like, all right, this guy could probably do some video game stuff.
Not in film, but give him the video games.
Exactly. And so what I realized, I was very lucky. Because I was working with the most talented artists in the industry.
Yeah,
LucasArts.
Yeah, hell.
And I'm an engineer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I quickly realized that no matter no matter what I do, I'm never going to be as talented as they are. However, I'm an engineer, so I'm discovering there are all these problems that the artists are running into. They want to make a level that you play around flying around an asteroid, but their terrain generator won't generate spherical terrain. Or they want to be able to bake shadows, but these are the days they didn't have shadow baking yet in in Maya or Max. So there were all these problems they were running into, and there were artists, and there was things they wanted to achieve visually or with gameplay they couldn't achieve it. I go, wait a minute, I can solve this problem. That's trigonometry. Like, that's calculus. I got this. And I started like building tools. And that's where I realized, okay, my mission in life is not to be a great artist. That's not my calling. But my job is to make sure that the technology doesn't get in the way of what the artists want to achieve.
Right.
So they have a vision of what they want to create, and my job is to make sure the limitations of the hardware, or the software, whether it's the limitations of 3D Studio Max or the limitations of the PS2, doesn't prevent them from achieving what they want to create. And that was super fulfilling. The next thing I know, I'm not doing any animation. I'm just making one tool after another, and that sort of paved the way for the rest of the career. Like, that's what I was doing at DirectX. My job in DirectX was to make sure that, video game hardware 5 years from now in the next generation console would have what video game designers, artists, wanted to be able to have, whether it was better trees, better characters, better post effects. What are the things we want to be, better terrain? What are the things we want to be able to create? And then my team's job was I would think about like to enable them, but really it's to make sure that the limitations of the hardware or the limitations of the software doesn't prevent them from achieving what they want to create. Right. And then later on, after that, I sort of moved up on the business side, and now I'm a suit. So now my job is to make sure that not only do we make sure the technology doesn't get in the way of what creative designers and artists want to create, it's also making sure that the business doesn't get in the way of what they want to create.
What's interesting about your story is that, if I just take a step back, you're effectively facilitating expertise. You're making it possible for the experts to do what they do great, and you're giving them tools, and now you're doing the business aspect of it. Was there an aha moment? Like, obviously animation was something that you loved, but where was that moment where you're like, you know what, I'm damn good at making tools? Like, which, do you remember that one moment, or did it just gradually happen? Where it's just like, oh, okay.
It was just one random day. I remember some artist was like fighting with some software, and it was a complicated. I think it was like it was like a terrain problem or something, and it was like a complicated math problem. The artists and the tools just weren't working, and they had planned to use a certain tool to do what they wanted to do, and they couldn't, and that like meant that the schedule was at risk.
Right.
And I looked over and I was like, I think I can fix this, and I just like spent the afternoon on it, or maybe the evening. Came back the next day with a tool, and it was like magic.
Wow.
The artist was like, "Oh, this does exactly what. How do you do this?" I was like, "Oh, started explaining the math, and I realized, like, yep, no, this is why I'm an engineer." And I think from there it just snowballed, and that's been sort of the theme of the career.
Okay,
it's like, how do you enable people who are more talented than you in other disciplines, and make sure that your discipline doesn't get in their way?
Well, okay, so then here's the thing. You go from animator to basically you're always an engineer, but your passion's animation. Then you realize engineering is great. You're at Microsoft. How do you become a suit? When does the conversion to I'm no longer an engineer, I'm now a businessman? How does that happen?
I think I started out in like, I guess program management, which is sort of like a combination of production and product management. And then just sort of, and then I was promoted to management and had teams under me. I guess you start out at Microsoft kind of managing without authority, and then they give you authority. And so that worked out pretty well. Like, how do you get people to do things by convincing them it's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
And only when you're good at that do they actually let you, manage people with direct authority.
Well, then when did you realize that you could actually run a company? At what point were you just like, you know what, I was good running this, but now I'm just going to run a business? I think, especially a video.
Right. Have you or I realized we can even do that yet? I think we're still figuring it out, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I like I pretend I'm a CEO. I'm actually a podcast host. That's what I do. That's my day job.
You are a great podcast host.
Well, thank you so much. There we go. But I found my true calling. Seriously, like, it's another 180. Animator, engineer, tools programmer, and now all of a sudden you're like, I'm just going to run a company.
Yeah. I was lucky. So I was the FTX Games. Like, I wasn't a founder of that company. I had helped them I had advised them and helped them raise some money, along with a whole bunch of other gaming startups that I had been helping back when I was at Microsoft.
Right.
And they raised capital, had built some really great tech that I thought was really relevant, and they were looking for a CEO. And so they offered me the job. So I had managed a team at Microsoft. I hadn't run a company before. I was hired. I guess we need to talk about adventures. So I was hired into a pre-revenue, pre-product startup in gaming in a country that at the time was in Israel. So at the time they had no track record in gaming. Yeah. And I was hired in 2008.
Yeah.
6 months before the world economy went to hell. So that was bringing a company through that
Yeah.
to eventually become, a go-to game studio for Hollywood that was, successfully acquired 6 years later. I mean, that was quite the adventure. And I kind of felt like coming out of that, I could do anything.
Very much true. Well, you were
Yeah.
in
So
Hollywood.
the second time around, when I was actually the founder, when I started Level X, I'd been through quite a lot, and I was like, all right, now I know how to do this.
I now have the experience and the scars to make this happen, to make this work for me now, right?
Yeah.
You
Like
know,
I said, and Level X was certainly much smoother.
well, okay. So why is that? What is what? It sounds like there's a lesson in there somewhere. Why is it smoother?
Oh, I mean, I made a lot of mistakes the first time around.
Yeah, of course, as one does.
And it was my first time doing a lot of things. First time raising venture capital. These are all things. These are skills you develop over time. But I didn't have a good mental model for how that works, and the dynamic of investors and boards and conflicting priorities until I'd been through it a few times, until I've been through it. And then, so with Level X, it was it's a lot smoother in terms of things like raising capital, growing the business, and then eventually, to successful acquisition. We are now, I think, the only games company that's ever been acquired by, a large healthcare or med tech company.
So let's talk about that because I mean, you go from basically the Hollywood making Hollywood games, and then you stumble into basically you found the product market fit. You found people that needed something, and then you could make that for them. When we look at your games like Level X, you're making now like Cardio X and the COVID-19 diagnosis. I mean, how are you seeing this change the way this profession and the doctors are going? Like, how do you keep refining that? Because I mean, you went from your dad and then you seeing that to then saying, "Hey, there's more here." Take us through that. How did you guys all come into that place?
I mean, now Level X, we're at 3 million players, over 800,000 registered medical professionals. We're the only games where you can earn actually CME credit. Doctors can earn continuing medical education credit from playing a video game.
Wow.
And the games cover a huge swath of challenges of medical practice, everything from the obvious stuff, surgery. How do you remove an embedded nail from a patient's throat, or, deal with, a gastrointestinal bleed during a GI procedure, orthopedic surgery. Like, we do a lot of surgical stuff. We also do a lot of clinical stuff. If you think about, how the challenge of diagnosing a patient presenting with weird symptoms, right? We call rare disease diagnosis. That's a puzzle game.
Yeah.
Some of the challenges doctors face, there's nothing visual. So for surgery, we do all the crazy computational fluid dynamics and soft tissue simulation and crazy ultrasound and X-ray simulation on the GPU, and that's super fun. But a lot of the challenges doctors face, you don't see anything. You're looking at test results. You're asking the patient questions. And so that's a puzzle game.
Yeah.
When you think about managing a patient over time, I have a patient with multiple comorbidities. All the treatments that I can offer have side effects. So how do I thread that needle, right? How do I balance that? That's a strategy game. And so when you think about the challenges that doctors face, they map to our arsenal of game mechanics. If you have talented game designers that can see that connection, and now doctors can just play a game on their phone and really develop a mental model for things that they otherwise would only really learn by trial and error on live patients.
It's interesting you say that because you're absolutely right. I mean, they're puzzle, it's strategy. You're literally bringing in mechanics that by nature they're already doing, except now you're putting it within a structure that you can visualize as well. And it's entertaining to play along the side. When you looked at the first success, the first one that you did with your father, and it started to build up, was there a moment where you're like, this is a real business? It's not just, I did something for my dad. Was it instant almost, or was it like a couple weeks later, or a year later? I mean, when did you realize, like, no, this is an actual take off and run business?
So clearly there was product market fit.
Right.
Immediately.
Right.
That was when I went on iTunes Connect and saw the numbers.
Yeah.
And then, okay, but does this really move the needle? That's when I Googled it, and I was like, oh, yes. Like, there are, medical schools in China, and they're doing, they're doing tests where they have half the students use it, half don't, and they observe their performance. Whoa. Okay. The next thing is business model. And then I go, okay, so I'm sitting on this audience of 100,000 medical professionals. What's the value of that audience? And how do I make money? And here we use the same business models that we use in games.
Right.
So, when we did Hollywood, so one of the challenges in games, so a lot of games are monetized through sponsorship, through advertising.
Right.
But one of the challenges in games is that advertising, you don't get much money from advertisers. They don't spend a lot. So that's why a lot of free-to-play games, you'll see that, 99% of their revenue is coming from 1% of their players.
Yeah.
Which is kind of unfortunate. Like the dream of free-to-play was, oh, great, now everyone can play, and based on how much people play, they'll spend. But actually what ends up happening is you end up contorting the game design to try to find whales and, milk all the money out of them and turn the other 99% into cannon fodder. But the beauty of in healthcare is doctors are actually a very valuable audience for industry. So for medical device companies, life science companies. And so what we have the ability to do is provide sponsorship where with basically playable ads.
Yeah.
So doctors can come into the game. All the advertising is actually completely opt-in. It's optional. So there's a bunch of free content you can play. And then if you want to, you can try out the latest device from Philips or from Medtronic or from Boston Scientific. It's similar to the model. I think it's like if you've ever been to a medical conference or even I guess GDC, right? There's a whole bunch of content that you go to. It's lectures. Mm-hmm. There's doctors presenting difficult cases. And then next door, there's the expo hall, which is sponsored by industry. Our games work the same way. There's a bunch of free content you can play and earn CME. And then next to it, there's sponsored content you can play where you can learn about how to use, the latest argon plasma coagulator or intravascular ultrasound or, understand the mechanism of action of how, this inhaled anesthetic works. And it's lots of fun. And what we realized is then that it creates a business model where that scales beautifully. The more doctors play, the more money we make, the more great content we can make for doctors, the more we can improve their performance, the more specialties we can get into, and we can offer it for free to doctors worldwide. So for maximum reach.
Let me ask you something. It's interesting because you find this new market and you're in there, and were the doctors like, we've never seen this before? I mean, was there a moment in time where they for themselves are like, wow, like this is? I mean, obviously you have this user base, so clearly they're enjoying it. But when doctors were, they're serious people, or were they just like, no, this is fun, that's why I learn? Like, I guess what I'm trying to understand is like, did they recognize immediately that the power of what you had made was because it was fun? Or was it like, we can't say that it's fun. It's purely scientific and purely, I guess what I'm trying to say here is how serious were they willing to accept the fact that I'm learning because I'm enjoying myself versus, no, this is just a technique and it's very, like robotic. I mean, I guess.
So early on, we were very nervous. So we weren't sure if we were going to be a medical company that uses games or if we were going to be a medical game company. And what we realized is the game stuff resonates.
Yeah.
I mean, there's 3 billion people playing games. Doctors are playing games. When I go and present to doctors, you can even say, how many of you are gamers? Now, the surgeons, a lot of them will raise their hands, but a lot of folks won't. And then you go, okay, well, how many of you play Candy Crush? How many of you play Angry Birds? Well, okay, everyone, fine. And then everyone raises their hand. Everyone's playing games. And so I think what pulls them in often is the technology. Oh my gosh, like I'm here doing a virtual colonoscopy on my phone and it looks completely realistic. And as I move, my tools around, the tissue is squishy and the blood moves realistically and I can cauterize and it looks just like it does in real life. Like I had no idea such a thing was possible. I don't even really believe that it's running on a cell phone, that thing that drops my calls all the time. But then as they start playing it, they realize like all the challenge that we've built in, the sort of that balance of reward and frustration, challenge and skill that games have been optimizing for the last 30 years. And they go like, they love it. The more you can actually see the progression in our games, we have more and more we call it juice, right? There's more and more visual effects. There's more and more like, particle explosions and things that you wouldn't actually see inside the heart, but really make doing it wrong frustrating and doing it right rewarding. And when you do that, it amplifies the dopamine release in the brain and accelerates learning.
There you go. It's you're basically putting the emphasis, which you're putting reinforcements, positive reinforcement. It says, "Hey, it's
Yeah.
like, attaboy, thanks for going." So,
Right. And
okay,
sometimes all the reinforcement you need is a good, if all of a sudden you remove the polyp and it starts gushing blood, I don't need to add anything there. But sometimes the indicators are more subtle, and that's where we end up using a lot more. We have technical artists that are adding game visual effects to add frustration and reward.
so okay, you're doing this and you're being successful. How does a pharmaceuticals company then enter your guys'? Well, how did that happen? Like the acquisition, all that. Is it they're just like there's no one like you in the market, or how did that all come together?
There's really nobody doing this.
Yeah.
And so now we're working with 30 out of the top 40 life science and med device companies.
Wow.
Basically accelerate training, accelerate adoption of their products. Just because someone comes out with a new medical device that's revolutionary and drastically improves patient outcomes, it can be a decade or more until that becomes the standard of care. And it's not because doctors are backwards. It's not because doctors are Luddites. It's simply because, well, who's going to be the first 100 patients that they're going to have to practice the new procedure on until they get as good at it as they were on the old device. Mm-hmm. And so we can come in and we can accelerate that, whether it's, all right, how do I identify which patients are actually indicated for this treatment or for this surgery, or, how do I properly do it? And so, we're able to really show that we're able to accelerate that. And so now we're sort of working with everybody. We're also working with major medical societies that, launch new guidelines that might take, a decade to disseminate because no one can memorize them. But we're able to make games where you just play through different patient cases and you learn about you develop a mental model for those guidelines. We're working with NASA to adapt all this technology to train astronauts how to deal with emergencies on deep space missions. So we just continue to create value for everybody in the ecosystem. It's valuable for doctors. They get to learn about these things. And in some cases earn CME. It's valuable for the companies because they can accelerate adoption of their products, and they can also reduce, bad outcomes from doctors using them incorrectly. So it's good all around. We were, like I said, we were acquired by BrainLab. They were one of our customers. We were building game content for them, and they ended up, it's just like always the best story for companies when your customer acquires you.
Okay, so you're basically doing this work for them, and they're like, "This is the unicorn. There's no other unicorn here." Were you surprised to see that there was no other businesses like yours in the space, or did it just make sense that no one had found the niche?
I think it was that happy accident. Mm-hmm. If you had asked me, in 2010, you're like, "Oh, Sam, 10 years from now, you're going to be making games for doctors." I'd be like, "Wait, what? How does that even work business-wise, right?" Coming from games, I'd be like, "How are you going to rally the audience? What's the business model?" Only when I actually rallied the audience by accident was I like, "Oh, this modality works."
Yeah.
The way it's worked, I mean, people have been building simulators in healthcare for decades. What are they? They're these big, expensive equipment, right? They usually cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're bought by medical schools. They put them in sim centers. So you have these simulation centers that cost $50 million to stand up. There's only like 200 of them in the country. They're inaccessible by 90% of practicing doctors. They're stocked with these $250,000 simulators that all look like video games out of the 90s. The technology is terrible. And that's the model. And nobody thought of anything else. And I look at it now from the game standpoint and I go, well, we had that model in the 80s when, when it was the video arcade, right? Where you had all the games were in a physical location. Yeah. They were very expensive. They were expensive to maintain, but you had to put them in a physical location because the hardware was really expensive. And nowadays you have more compute power on your phone than you had in all the arcades in the world in 1990. And so we're just bringing over not just the technology, we're bringing over the distribution and the business model.
So this is a great segue over towards the metaverse. What does the metaverse mean to you? How do you define it? Because I mean, I'm going to ask you this because I can imagine that what you're doing, it's like fine. That's like this is the adult version of like this is serious stuff,
Yeah.
and this is an application. So let's first metaverse it. What is that word for you in your definition? Not the crazy shit, but your
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm itching a little bit because I'm a little allergic to buzzwords.
yeah. Okay,
Uh, but no, we'll go for it. We'll go for it.
yeah.
So
Go for
look,
it. Let's
I
do it.
look
Let's
at
do
it
it.
like actually, what's funny. So my grandfather, he was the senior editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association. In the late '70s, wrote a book called Medicine's Metaphors, where he talked about like, I'll talk about the subject later. But I think it's ironic. The reason I'm willing to talk about the metaverse, I think it's ironic of his grandson, 50 years later, talking about medicine's metaverse. So
Yeah.
fine.
No, I mean it's. I mean,
Call it
it's
family
pretty
tradition.
weird.
So, okay. So when we were DirectX, right? Like the idea was to basically create this platform that allows game developers to create any universe that they want. And we built game technology to tell stories, right? To allow people to tell stories for entertainment purposes. And they've told amazing stories and they built this incredible medium. There's a lot of like nonsense hype in the news, this sort of like Mark Zuckerberg vision that like the purpose of all this tech, like we say, the job in DirectX was to predict the future. And the sort of Zuckerberg view is the future is we all put on a VR headset and we make a cheesy digital twin of ourselves and we buy that cheesy digital twin some, fake artificial real estate and virtual Nike shoes. And that's the future of commerce. And I don't know, I feel like at worst, a lot of that is a fraud. At best, it's just an ill-informed vision of where all this technology takes us. In medicine, for example, I've got we built a cloud gaming platform for medicine. Like sort of PlayStation Now and Microsoft
Really?
xCloud. This idea that you can run the game in the cloud. So we built one specifically for medicine. What it allows is like you and I could hop on Zoom and I just send you a link or a QR code, and you and I are doing surgery on a virtual patient simulated on a cloud server.
Right.
So having, I can just show you examples. Like we have all sorts of different companies using this now to train doctors remotely.
Right.
And so having, hundreds of thousands of medical professionals training collaboratively over Zoom, not on a physical patient in front of them, but on a virtual patient simulated in the cloud, that to me is the promise of the metaverse. We run events with different partners where you'll have like 200, 400 doctors in person, remote, basically playing party games. What they're doing is there's a presenter presenting a patient case, and then the race is on for everybody in the audience to collaborate and compete to diagnose the virtual patient that's simulated in the cloud. This to me, that's the promise of the metaverse. But it's very specific. It's applied. Like they're not all wearing VR headsets, navigating their avatars around a virtual hospital. They're picking up their phones. They're snapping a QR code. There's a virtual 3D patient that's simulated on a cloud server. And all right, let's try to find the symptoms. All right, let's identify all the symptoms of psoriasis. Race is on. And these, I think, these are interesting applications of metaverse technology.
Yeah.
And they're delivering on the promise of the metaverse.
Agreed.
Right? This idea of it's going to change the way companies interact with their customers. It's going to change the way people learn. It's going to change the way people interact.
Yeah.
Right? And explore ideas.
Yeah.
But we're delivering on this today. We're just not, we've been doing this for the last few years. We're just not calling it metaverse. If you want to call it metaverse, you can. I would argue this is the best example of it. Yeah. But a lot of the crap we read about in the news, like there's no enduring value there. Like, and we see it, like people who jump into these like virtual metaverse raves come out of it and say, I didn't get anything from it. But we have doctors coming out of these experiences showing measurably they're learning better. We have companies showing they're able to, convince doctors better and accelerate the adoption of their products faster. They can measure it. It's actually moving the needle.
So this is the thing is that I'm with you 100% because for me the metaverse is all about utility. It's applied learning. Yeah. It's applied fun. It's literally an adjective or a verb. It's a verb going forward that I'm doing something with it, and that for me the metaverse is my GPS. Here's my first metaverse version. Take me to my home. Show me a 3D representation of my neighborhood that 30 years ago was impossible for me even to look at without actually going and walking down the street.
Yeah,
So
there's a virtual representation
exactly, virtual
of a
representation.
digital representation of the world. Yeah.
Exactly. And then it was the utility was so I'm not lost. So I can find my
Yep.
way, right? Now when we start thinking about what you guys are doing and what Level X has done, do you see this starting to be applied in other industries? It's happening with medical. Do you see this coming into other highly skilled, what do we say is basically where it's very critical. I mean, you're in NASA, clearly deep space.
Yeah.
You don't want to die. Clearly is one thing. But do you see other applications of this starting to come in that you're like, oh wow, people are getting acute. They're following the Level X way, or you're thinking, you know what, we're going to enter this market because it just makes sense for us to be there. How do you see that?
So I think Level X is always going to stay in medical,
Okay,
but what we're doing is certainly applicable in other industries.
right.
Any industry where people need to develop a mental model for a complex system,
Hmm.
you're going to want to use games. Now, in healthcare, it makes, that's one of the more obvious ones because the stakes are high. But if you think about factories, you think about oil and gas, you think about, you know, all sorts of different fields where, engineering, where people need to develop mental models of complex systems, games are the most effective way to do that. So when I think about what we're doing in healthcare, we're essentially like establishing games as a fundamental force,
Yeah.
accelerating learning and adoption in healthcare. So, today you say we make games for doctors, people raise an eyebrow. Like, what does that mean, games for doctors? But a few years from now, I used to say 5 years from now, and I think it's probably closer to 2 or 3, you're going to say games for doctors, and doctors are going to be like, oh yeah, games for doctors. Hasn't that always been a thing?
Yeah. I grew
And
up.
so games just take their place alongside presentations and lectures and cadaver labs and videos as an accepted modality of training. And when do you use it? It's when you need to develop a mental model of a complex system. Gosh, you know what? This video is not going to cut it. I really need to play with this.
Yes.
Right, when you get a new phone, you don't read the manual. You don't watch a video. You just start playing with it. All right,
Exactly.
how do we enable that? That's what we're doing for healthcare. In games, I think of what we're doing as genre creation.
Yeah.
Right? The apex achievement in games is not just creating a successful game. We've all done that. It's creating a new genre.
Yeah.
And we're creating a new genre of medical games at Level X, but my expectation is that's going to expand. You're going to have other players in the space. The characteristic of a genre is that there isn't just one player. And I'm expecting you'll also see an emergence of a genre of professional games where healthcare leads the way.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I mean, at that moment in time, when we first started our careers, it was like gaming that's for entertainment, that's wasting time. I remember I got it plenty of times. You're just wasting your life. It's not going to go anywhere. Now what you guys are doing is basically saving lives, training people, getting them up to speed, helping them learn. And I love this visualizing a mental model and basically creating it of a complex system. I think that's really how you nail that. It's just perfect. But if you think about it from this also perspective, the fact that other industries also need to learn this way or can learn this way,
Yeah.
you see a generational function happening where it's just Gen Z, always born internet on, always can interact with something, and therefore it's just going to be by default because this is happening? Or do you think it's really just because of the fact that we finally accept as people that gaming truly is another medium to be utilized for everything? How do you see it?
Yeah. I think this isn't just a Gen Z thing. We're constantly doing efficacy studies on everything we make.
Yeah.
We've actually been doing some studies recently. We're starting to show that the more patients doctors see, the more they enjoy this.
Wow.
This is not just for medical students or residents. No, when you talk about continuing medical education, that's for practicing doctors. Our
Yes.
primary audience is practicing doctors who are, years, decades into their careers. So I don't think that this is something that happened because of it's a new generation of doctors. I think this could have happened 10 years ago.
Right.
The reason this is happening is simply the reason it hasn't happened before is no one created the content.
Yeah.
Like you've had people making like kind of silly, serious games that all look like Second Life graphics from the 90s and no real game design.
Yeah, no
And
production.
that
Yeah.
hasn't moved the needle, right?
Right.
But like the first time you actually bring, some talented game developers who don't compromise on the fun and say, no, we're using the fun as a tool to make this more effective. Now all of a sudden that's how you start getting, that's how you start getting the serious reach.
So let me ask you, do the medical professionals want high realism or like okay, remember in the games we're like fidelity, super realistic graphics, 1,000 blah. Are the doctors like that, or they're just like, you know what? I just need it to be more accurate than it needs to be high fidelity. Like,
It
what
depends completely on what you're doing.
okay.
Just like games, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, no,
some
true.
games you really care about fidelity, and some you want it to be more abstract.
Yeah.
Same thing with games for doctors. So I'll give you an example where
Yeah.
fidelity is super important. So we just released a game a year ago in dermatology. It's growing like crazy. Talk about capturing challenges. One of the major challenges in dermatology is recognizing skin disease on skin tones you don't normally see in your practice.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So diseases manifest very differently on skin of color, and skin of color
Absolutely.
is not just one skin tone.
Absolutely.
It's a
Yeah.
range of skin tones.
Yeah.
Whether the disease manifests, how it manifests above the pigment, below the pigment, it will look very, very different on different parts of the body and different skin tones. And it's well known that when people of color go to the dermatologist, they get worse outcomes. And it's not because the dermatologist is racist, it's not out of malice. It's simply because he or she hasn't seen your skin disease on your skin tone enough times to have a mental model for how it looks. And so we said, all right, we can solve this problem with games. And we were like, great, we're going to go grab a bunch of material, a bunch of reference images of these diseases on different skin tones, and we'll make a game around it. And we went out and looked, and we could not find them. Because if you look in the literature, if you open a derm textbook, 90% of the images are on the same Caucasian skin tone. So, all right, there's a problem.
Yeah.
So what we did is we took basically video game skin rendering technology, the stuff we've been perfecting in the games industry for the last 15 years, and we built on top of it, basically on all those art pipelines and all those rendering systems with subsurface scattering and everything, we built a system using Substance and all these tools that allows us to generate basically any skin disease on skin of any color, on any part of the body, and under any lighting environment, in order to help dermatologists recognize those diseases. Now, in order to do that, you've got to be able to make it so real they literally can't tell the difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is what we do.
That's amazing.
And that's just a credit to the amazing artists and AAA tools that have come out of the games industry that we've been able to build on top of to do that. That's some area where realism is crucial. There are other areas where it's less important.
So let me ask you, for the people that are out there listening, for our audience, if they want to be Sam, they want to follow in your footsteps. I mean, you literally put out a career that's incredible, man. What advice would you give them? Especially for the young ones out there.
All right, so we're having a lot of fun. Actually, the first thing I should note, because on a previous one, you're mentioning how we're taking all this silly entertainment stuff and applying it in now for good and saving lives. Yeah. I really I want to be careful with that dichotomy, because I actually think that building games is incredibly fulfilling.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're entertaining people. We're telling stories.
Yeah.
Like, people in the video games industry in general index high on the fulfillment scale. So I don't like to be like, oh, level X, now game developers can finally have meaning. It's like making games is incredibly meaningful.
Exactly.
We tend to attract a group that's like, you know what, I've created this successful game before. I built, I've worked in this genre. I did, I built, a bunch of successful titles. Now I want to, now I want to try to apply this in an area that's going to have, a different benefit for society. And I think that's great. In terms of how to get here, I mean, look, I can only give advice based on what I've experienced, but what worked for me is, tinkering, right? Like, don't wait for a class to teach you this stuff. I mean, we live in a world today. I mean, I remember when I started making computer animation in the 90s, I had to, finagle teachers at my high school, in my computer lab to buy things that, under normal circuit, no one could afford. Nowadays, it's all available for free.
Yeah.
Unreal Engine, Unity, Blender, you can just, all the stuff we're using to make the same games you're playing, you can download it for free. There's endless videos on YouTube that show you how to use the tools. So there's really no excuse to not jump in and start using the tools. Don't wait for someone at some, game college or whatever to teach it to you. Just start jumping in and making things. That is the way to do it. If you look at my career, the way I got the job at LucasArts was because I did animation as a hobby. Yeah. The way I built Level X was I did this as a favor to my dad.
Yeah.
Working on side projects and exploring, being curious about new technologies and playing with them, right, is how I was able to sort of open up. It was a combination of luck
Yeah.
I don't want to. There was a lot of luck in there, but also just like the fact that I've been playing around with all these tools meant that when I saw the need, I was able to. I had enough of a toolbox to be
Yeah.
able to address it.
Well, you're prepared, and that curiosity that you had, and you still have, led you to create an amazing company that is literally like when you first told me about it. I remember this at GDC, and you're telling me about it, and I was like, "Oh my god, it made sense." I mean, it's just it's like a dream come true where you go into another industry that literally looks and sees you're like you're Gandalf. We're street magicians in games. You're Gandalf in the medical industry. Like I've never seen it before, and it's incredible, man, because it's a application of expertise and everything that comes together to do something and help other people. I mean, and that's something that for me, what I really I got to tell you, I find it phenomenal what you do because it does help people, and I think that's ultimately something that in the end of the day, we entertain people, but you're also helping people. It literally save lives. I think that's something that's very commendable, and it's something that our industry and games in general, we're now breaking into that point where that is something that we all get to say. Games does more than just entertain. That's a big deal.
Yep.
That's a big deal. I got just one last question for you, and I don't know if this has happened yet or how you see it. Do you see a moment when maybe doctors become game designers and they say, you know what, I'm going to design the game because I know this better than anyone else? Is that already happening, or that someone's like, you know what, I don't want to be a surgeon anymore. I want to be a game designer. I mean,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
you see what I'm
So I
saying?
mean, it's already happening in as much as we literally have surgeons standing over artists' shoulders and game designers' shoulders virtually and in person, helping us make these games.
Yeah.
Right. So like we look like any other game studio,
Hmm.
but we have a QA team and an engineering team and an art team and a design team, and we also have a medical team,
That's
which
insane.
is a team of full-time MDs and biomedical engineers who are delving into this. But they go broad, right? They're working on making sure that they're translating, helping translate this so the artists and engineers can understand it, and then they're also working with hundreds of advisor specialists that are helping us design the games. And we actually have a bunch of them who are like hardcore gamers. So they really understand. Like they're not sitting there necessarily in. Sometimes they are in Unity, but what we want to do is we want to partner them with people that have lots of experience doing this in the consumer world,
Yeah.
and then they're the ones who are asking the right questions and distilling from the doctor. All right, what makes it challenging for you? What's the indication in surgery that something's gone wrong? How do you know? What gives you that adrenaline rush? And then turning that into game mechanics. So that's really where it's that collaboration where you see some of the best results.
Sam, that's awesome. Thank you so much for your time and joining us this week on Video Games Real Talk, man. Do you have anything else you want to say to the audience out there?
Oh no, it's been awesome being here. Thank you, Alexander. Level X is hiring. So, if
Yeah,
you
shout
if
it
you're
out.
interested in joining the team, we're always looking for talented, experienced engineers, artists, designers,
Where do they find
biomedical
you? Are you on
engineers.
Twitter, Facebook? Like, how do people get a hold of you? Shout it out.
Oh yeah, I'm Sam Glassenberg on LinkedIn. I'm Sam ZG on Twitter. You can just go to levelx.com. It's levelex.com. And check out our job openings and feel free to apply.
Awesome, Sam. Everyone, thank you again for listening to Video Games Real Talk. It is season 4. We will be coming out every week with a new show. Looking forward to sharing them with you, the expertise and knowledge of our guests. As always, if you have any comments or questions or concerns, please feel free to hit us up on social media. You can get me at StarvUp. You can also find us at VGRT. And of course, as always, please share with your friends. Sam, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. All right.
Thank you.
And thank you.